Hey guys, what's up? Today I wanted to take the time to talk to you and go over the new Azerite Armor that was introduced in the most recent Battle for Azeroth Alpha build. Now this is its very first iteration, and while many traits and aspects of it will potentially be changing, it is something that's nice to take a look at and see a little bit ahead of time. Now before we jump into the 3 class specific traits in the first row, I wanted to talk about the 4 shared traits that are shared across every spec and talent specialization regardless of the class. Starting in the first row, we have the Champion of Azeroth, which is a passive, and it says contributing to the death of an enemy of Azeroth, heals you for 786 and grants you 26 versatility for 1 minute, which stacks up to 2 times. Now the main thing that I was actually wondering about here is what constitutes an enemy of Azeroth. You know, we are heading into a PvP based expansion, but I don't think they'd specifically be talking about an opposing faction member because, I mean, realistically, they're not an enemy of Azeroth, they're just an enemy of your faction. So that's going to be interesting to see, and one thing to keep in mind, you know, a little bit later on the alpha, and to see what that really constitutes. Moving down to the 7th row, we actually have the first trait here, which is called Vampiric Speed. It's another passive, and it says, when an enemy you damage dies, you heal for 786 and gain 60 speed for 6 seconds. It's an interesting trait. It provides a small heal, and the speed increase could be pretty nice. I think it could also be pretty useful in Dungeons and Mythic Plus. And the other passive that we have here is called Resounding Protection. And it says every 30 seconds you gain an Absorb Shield for 262 for 30 seconds. So it's an effect very similar to Prydaz that we have currently on the live servers. It even has the actual same image there that Prydaz uses. So that's going to be very interesting. I guess it depends more so on what you're doing. I could see Resounding Protection being a bit more useful for raiding and things in general, while I could see Vampiric Speed being used a lot more so in Mythic Plus or things where you're trying to get through pretty quickly. If we look here, we see the final talent in the 10th row is called Azerite Empowered, and it just increases the item level on this item specifically by 5. At this point, it's referring to the breastplate of the champion or whatever Azerite armor you have corresponding to your specific class. Now, looking at the 2nd row of Azerite traits here, we get to the more of the role-specific traits. I'm going to dive right in, and I'm actually on a Paladin here, which I thought would be the easiest to show you the initial traits, seeing as a Paladin has a DPS spec, a tank spec, and a healing spec. So the first trait that we see here is called Winds of War, and it says taking damage grants you 17 dodge for 3 seconds, stacking up to 10 times. Now this is obviously the tanking trait, and one thing to keep in mind here, as I mentioned a bit ago, is that these traits aren't changeable, and once you actually choose a trait, you're basically stuck with that trait for, I guess, the duration of you wearing its actual piece of Azerite armor. So, you know, so let's say you're actually a tank. You tank a decent bit of time, but you alternate between tanking and DPSing from time as well. Winds of War is the passive tanking trait, but you might be a little bit more interested in taking Elemental Whirl, which is a passive, and it says your damaging abilities have a chance to grant you Elemental Whirl, increasing your critical strike, haste, mastery, or versatility by 97 for 10 seconds. Now, it doesn't indicate whether this is your highest stat it's always chosen, or if it's just truly a random proc. But these abilities, or these stats I should say, do grant you a bit more defensiveness as well as offensiveness, and it doesn't lock you into the specific, you know, tanking trait Winds of War, which is effectively useless for a DPS, versus this being useful for both, you know, tanking aspect and DPS aspects. So, and the actual healing trait we see here is called Wound Binder. It's a passive, and it says your healing effects have a chance to increase your haste by up to 78% or 78 for 6 seconds. Healing lower health targets will grant you more haste. But one thing that's interesting here, and then I guess one thing you'll have to see a little bit farther when the BFA Alpha continues, is what is the actual proc rate of this? Is this an effect that you're going to have rolling, you know, a good bit of the time, or is this something that you're just going to have, you know, proc randomly every once in a while, and it's useful to have around when it procs? So these are the 3 corresponding traits when it comes to, you know, class specializations. And one thing to, you know, mention here as well is that certain classes obviously have 2 or 3 DPS specs, and I know that priests also have 2 healing specs. So next we'll actually take a look at the priest traits here, and you'll see they will have Elemental Whirl as their DPS class, but they will also have a second healing trait, which we're going to get into right now. Now, as I just mentioned, you know, priests do have 2 healing specs, both Holy and Disc, and they also have Shadow as their DPS spec. And if we look right here, as we can see, their first, you know, talent that's available to be chosen is Wound Binder, which was the same as the Holy Paladin, which is the same as the Mistweaver monks will have, and the other healing specs in the game. As you can see here, they also have Elemental Whirl, which is the passive damage increase, and which is obviously not very useful for Holy. It could be a bit useful for Disc, as the more I think about it, because you are doing damage while effectively healing with Atonement and things of the sort. So that's just something to keep in mind, where I'm not really sure which would be actually end up being better. You could choose, you know, Elemental Whirl for Disc, or if you are using actually Shadow for leveling and damage from time to time as well, this could be a talent that you actually want to look at and focus on and really think about if this is worth it to you mostly. But just one thing to keep in mind is that it wouldn't really work for Holy at all, as you're not doing a whole lot of damage, unless you're doing some small healer damage and some downtime. Their main trait, and this is their second healing trait, which you only see on a priest, is their only class with 2 healing specs, is called Savior. It's a passive, and it says your heals on targets below 35% health have a chance to heal for an additional 262. So it's going to be interesting to see which trait ends up being better for healing, whether it be Woundbinder, Savior, or if your disc potentially Elemental Whirl. I think a lot of it's going to come down to whether Woundbinder has a relatively high uptime on its proc, or if it's just something that procs maybe 10% of the time randomly. It's not really something that's useful, or something that you can count on having up as much as something where you can actually have Savior up or proc Savior a bit more, depending on its actual internal cooldown and proc rate as well. Now, taking a look here at the Azerite traits for DPS that you have available, depending on if you have 2 or 3 DPS talent specializations here, we already know about Elemental Whirl, but the second trait you actually get is called Gut Ripper with your second DPS talent specialization. It says your damaging abilities have a chance to deal 437 physical damage to the target. Gut Ripper occurs much more often against targets below 30% health. This is interesting. It's basically a bit of a passive DPS increase that, just randomly proc passively with your damaging abilities, but having it occur below 30% health is pretty interesting, as it offers, sort of a pseudo execute to certain classes that might not have it. Now, while the 437% or 437 physical damage, it's not a whole lot. Having it occur more in the execute window is always useful, because as you know, execute has always been pretty useful in raiding and PvE and things of the sort. Now, looking at our third DPS talent here, we have Blood Siphon. It's a passive, and it increases your mastery by 34% and your leech by 17. Having a small leech increase is always nice to have around, but the main thing we're looking at and focusing on here is the passive 34 mastery. Now, I would imagine that classes that value mastery a bit more are going to want it, or something similar to Elemental Whirl, which increases your damaging abilities by 97, or increases your haste master versatility by 97, excuse me. It's only on for 10 seconds, and I'm sure it has probably a 45 second to 1 minute internal cooldown, and we're not actually sure what the proc rate on it is yet. So, it's going to depend a lot on classes, I believe, whether they want the passive mastery, or if that small physical damage with Gut Ripper is going to be a bit more effective. I'm not sure what the actual internal cooldown on the Gut Ripper proc is. Maybe it's a bit more effective for classes like hunters than it is more like warriors with a two-handed axe, but we're gonna have to wait and see. Now, as I mentioned before, each class has their own specific spec specialization traits corresponding to the first row that we have here in your Azerite Armor, in addition to the Champion of Azeroth passive, which every class in spec has regardless. I will add timestamps for each individual class in the video in the description below, so if you want to skip to your specific class, feel free to scroll down to the description and click to your specific section of your class. Now, looking at Hunter here, we have 3 traits in the first row. We can see the first is called Serrated Jaws. It's a passive, and it says Kill Command has a 40% chance to deal an additional 197 physical damage and grant your pet 15 focus. The second is In the Rhythm, and it says when rapid fire finishes fully channeling, your haste is increased by 24 for 8 seconds. And the third one we have here is called Wildfire Cluster. It's a passive, and it says Wildfire Bomb drops a small cluster of bombs around the target, each exploding for 39 damage. Now, one thing you can notice here is that these do correspond to survival, marksmanship, and beast mastery. And one of the things I'm not really sure of, and I would imagine changes a bit coming up, I would imagine hopefully in new Battle for Azeroth Alpha builds, is that you're able to actually change these talents depending on which spec you're in. Because if you're stuck with having the option of just Serrated Jaws when you're switching to marksman or survival for a certain fight, it's going to be a pretty big hindrance when it comes to certain fights and having a change specs, which is something that people weren't a really big fan when it came to, I guess you could see that like Crucible being locked in the traits and things of the sort. So I'm hoping this has some, some way to change it. Maybe something along the lines of like Artifact Power initially did when when Legion first came out, and you were able to refund your traits at the cost of the current additional traits you were on at that point. So, taking a look at warriors here, in addition to the Champion of Azeroth trait, we have 3 class-specific traits. The first one is called Executioner's Precision. Execute increases the damage of your next mortal strike against a target by 296, stacking up by 2 times. Our second trait here we have is called Trample the Weak, and it says rampaging an enemy whose health percentage is lower than yours increases your versatility by 25 for 6 seconds. And our final trait we have here is called Deafening Crash, and it says when Thunderclap damages only one enemy, it deals 197 damage and grants you an absorption shield for 394. Taking a look at Paladins here, the first trait you have available is called Martyr's Breath. It says Light of the Martyr has a chance to cause your blessing of sacrifice to additionally heal the target for 6. This effect can stack up to 10 times. The second trait you have available is called Bulwark of Light, and it says Avenger's Shield grants you a shield absorbing 394 damage for 8 seconds. And our third trait here is called Avenger's Might, and while Avenging Wrath is active, you gain passive 58 Mastery. Here are the 3 traits that are actually available to the Priest, and we look at the first one here. It's called Moment of Repose. It says Pain Suppression applies atonement to the target and instantly heals them for 394. It's always nice to have another way to spread your atonement, even if it's locked to one of your main cooldowns. It's still nice to have around in general. The second trait is called Permeating Glow, and it says Flash Heal increases the healing of your flash heals on the ally by 79 for 6 seconds. This would be interesting, I guess a little bit more interesting if it's stacked. However, I feel like that would be pretty powerful in general, and having just a small heal increase is always nice to have around. Searing Dialogue is your final trait, and it says Mind Seer deals an additional 32 damage to enemies suffering from your Shadow Word Pain. Here we can see we're on a Mage, and taking a look at our 3 talents here. The first one is called Arcane Annihilation. It's a passive, and it says Arcane Blast deals an additional 194 damage while you have 4 arcane charges. The second trait we see here is called Flames of Alacrity, and it says Enhanced Pyrotechnics grants an additional 19% haste. And our first trait here is called Packed Ice. As you can see, it says Ice Lance deals an additional 43 damage to enemies recently damaged by your Frozen Orb. Taking a look at Warlocks here, we can see for Affliction's first talent we have Racking Brilliance, and it mentions that every other soul shard your agony generates also increases your intellect by 79 for 6 seconds. Now I think this would be interesting if it actually stacked, however, that it's sort of random when agony actually generates a shard a bit, and having a stack probably would lead to a little bit too much RNG, which is something I would hope that they're trying to get away from. Our second trait is called Shadow's Bite. This is your Demonology trait, and it says whenever your summoned Dreadstalkers fade away, they increase the damage of your Shadow Bolt by 59 for 8 seconds. We can see our final trait here for Destruction is called Heavy Rain, and it mentions whenever your Rain of Fire damages 3 or more targets, you gain 97 haste for 8 seconds. Looking at monks here, we can see our first trait is from Brewmaster. It's called Boiling Brew. It mentions that Keg Smash deals an additional 87 damage against targets burning from your Breath of Fire and heals you for 5% of the damage dealt to those targets. Looking at our second trait, which is for Mistweavers, it's called Invigorating Brew, and it says that Vivify does an additional 218 healing when empowered by Thunder Focus Tea. And our final trait is for Windwalkers, and it's called Iron Fist, which says Fist of Fury grants you 40 critical strike for 6 seconds when it hits at least 4 enemies. Next up we have Shaman. So you can see the first ability is called Volcanic Lightning, and it says a lava burst on a target that has been struck by your lightning in the last 4 seconds deals an additional 97 damage. This is probably going to constitute weaving lightning into your rotation a bit to get that additional 97 damage from lava burst. The second trait is called Primal Primer, and it mentions that melee attacks with Flame Tongue active increase the damage the target takes from your next Lava Lash by 19, stacking up to 10 times. And the final trait here we see is called Soothing Waters, and it mentions that your Chain Heal heals its primary target for an additional 29 healing. Now we're going to take a look at Rogues, with their first trait being called Double Dose. It says when Mutilate applies lethal poison with Wolf Daggers, it poisons them for an additional 118 damage. Their second trait is called Dead Shot, and it mentions Between the Eyes increases the damage of your next pistol shot by 582. And their third trait is called Sharpened Blades, and it says your auto attacks increase the damage of your next Shuriken toss by 19, stacking up to 20 times. Now taking a look at Druids here, they're the only class to actually have 4 traits in the first row, and that's due to them having 4 actual specs. The first trait is called Streaking Stars, and it says while Celestial Alignment is active, your spells call a Streaking Star, dealing an additional 291 damage while they are not a repeat of the previous ability. The second trait is called Primordial Rage, and it says while Berserk is active, your Rip deals an additional certain amount of damage each time it deals damage. Obviously that number will be changed, it's just a placeholder for now. The third trait is called Heartblood, and it says Mangle increases the healing of your next ability to heal you by 291. And the fourth trait is called Fungal Essence, and it mentions that Swift Mend causes your Efflorescence Mushroom to burst, healing a nearby injured ally for 291. Now taking a look at Demon Hunters here, they're a bit different because they only actually have 2 talent specializations. In addition to the passive, or I should say, Universal Champion of Azeroth trait, their first trait is called Devour, and it says, using Demon's Bite 3 times in a row grants you 29 mastery for 4 seconds. Their second trait is called Revel in Pain, and it mentions whenever Fiery Brand expires on your primary target, you gain a shield that absorbs up to 5,915 damage for 15 seconds based on the damage dealt to them while Fiery Brand was active. Now, one thing to look at here as well is that they also still do have 3 traits in the 4th row here. They have Winds of War, which is the tank trait here, for their Vengeance spec, and they also have Gut Ripper, which is the second DPS trait that we see when you actually have 2 DPS specs, which is, has a bit of the XQ tied into it. And they also have Elemental Whirl, and I mentioned a bit towards the beginning of the video how Elemental Whirl could be good for both tanking and DPSing, and here I guess it sort of plays into that a bit here as well. Once again, where it could be very useful if you're playing both Vengeance and Havoc, in general. And the final class we're going to be looking at today is Death Knights. You can see the first ability here is called Deep Cuts. It mentions whenever Hard Strike deals damage, it deals an additional 97 damage when hitting 3 or more targets and heals you for a percentage of the damage done. It's always nice to have a little bit of a passive healing coming from Hard Strike. The second ability we see here is called Icy Citadel, and it mentions the Pillar of Frost grants an additional 97 strength when you're above 75% health. And finally we have Festering Doom. It says Death Coil causes your next Festering Strike to deal an additional 97 damage. Thanks so much for watching today, guys. I just want to reiterate one more time that these are the initial Azerite traits, and I imagine they're going to be changed a few times over the course of the alpha and probably a good bit into beta as well. Let me know what you thought of your class's new Azerite traits and how it will interact with your rotation or build in the comments below. If you liked the video and want to see more World of Warcraft and Battle for Azeroth content, remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Thanks so much, guys. Peace.